Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're doing something a little bit different. We are cracking open a heavily redacted, decades-old dossier on what is easily one of the most terrifying, genuinely baffling events of the 20th century. I'm talking about the 1959 mystery of Dead Mountain. We're going to treat this as a strict forensic cold case review. Think about it. 9 hikers walk up a mountain, and weeks later, they're found with massive skull fractures, missing eyes, and a tent that was slashed open from the inside. To this very day, literally no one on Earth can tell you with absolute certainty what killed them. So we're just going to look strictly at the hard evidence. All right, let's look at our roadmap for this review. First, we'll cover the victims and their route. Second, the scene of the incident. Third, the first 5 bodies found. Fourth, the ravine autopsies. And finally, we'll dig into the declassified evidence and theories. Starting right off with Section 1, the victims and route. Now, to really understand why this case is so incredibly dissonant, we have to remember who we're talking about here. These were not reckless beginners or tourists making rookie mistakes in the snow. Led by a 23-year-old engineering student named Igor Dyatlov, this team left the city of Sverdlovsk on January 23rd. Originally, there were 10 of them, and Dyatlov, he was meticulous. He had checklists, contingency plans, the whole shebang. Actually, one hiker ended up turning back early because of severe joint pain, which, as it turns out, was a decision that saved his life. The other 9 pushed on and set up their last known camp on February 1st on the slopes of Kholat Syakhl. By the morning of February 2nd, which is the estimated time of death, all 9 vanished into the minus 30-degree weather. It wasn't until February 26th that a search party finally found their tent, and it took until May before the final bodies were pulled from the snow. And this right here brilliantly illustrates the central paradox of the entire case. Look at side A. Soviet authorities had actually classified their planned expedition as a Category 3 difficulty. That is literally the highest level possible. These were highly trained, methodical engineering students. They were winter survival experts. But then look at side B, the completely irrational evidence. They abandoned their shelter in the dead of night and walked out into deadly cold in their socks and underwear. Just process that for a second. Something made 9 trained, hardcore survivors choose certain death in the freezing snow over whatever was waiting for them inside that tent. Moving on to Section 2, the scene of the incident. So the team arrives at Kholat Syakhl. Translated by the indigenous Mansi people, that means dead mountain. And yeah, it earned that dark reputation. But here's what's really fascinating. When we look at the footprints at the scene, there's a complete lack of panic. When the search party found the tent, it was actually still standing. Inside, their warm gear, their boots, their food, totally untouched. In fact, the food was laid out for an evening meal, and the stove was fully set up. But the tent itself had been slashed open from the inside with a knife. These were ragged, urgent cuts made by someone who apparently couldn't afford the 2 seconds it takes to find a zipper. Yet, and this is the crazy part, the footprints leading downhill weren't running. They were walking, calm and steady. 9 people carved their way out of their shelter in the worst cold of winter, leaving all their life-saving gear behind, and just walked away in a steady line as if they'd all quietly agreed on it. To really wrap your head around what they stepped into without their boots, we have to think about the environment. At that elevation, at night, the temperature plummets to 30 below zero. The snow is crusted and sharp. It practically shatters under your feet. As our source beautifully but grimly describes it, the wind does not blow there so much as it presses, a flat, constant weight that moves through layers and fine skin. It's a brutal, completely unforgiving landscape that just drains the warmth out of everything. And they stepped right out into it, virtually unprotected. Which brings us to Section 3, the first 5 bodies. Let's look at the edge of the forest about a mile downhill from the tent. This scene paints a picture of just absolute, raw desperation. The search party found 2 bodies first, Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonishenko, near a massive cedar tree. They were in their underwear, and when investigators looked closer, the bark of that cedar tree was stripped 3 to 4 meters up. Think about that. In the pitch black, one of them had scrambled up that tree, tearing their fingers so badly that bits of skin were left behind in the wood. Down on the ground, there was evidence of a tiny, totally inadequate fire. Their hands were deeply burned. Not frostbitten, guys, fire burned. They had actually held their bare hands directly into the flames to fight off the 30 below cold, just to avoid feeling any colder than they already were. Now, between that cedar tree and the slashed tent, 3 more bodies were found. Igor Dyatlov himself was lying face up in the snow, with one arm raised as if he was desperately crawling back toward the tent when he finally succumbed.
Zinaida Kolmogorova was nearby, and her frozen expression showed what investigators could only call extreme distress. And then there was Rustem Slobodin. He was found with a fractured skull. Now, investigators initially just brushed this off, saying, it wasn't severe enough to be the cause of death. But let me tell you, they were going to radically change their tune on skull fractures before this case was over.
Let's move to Section 4, the ravine autopsies. Fast forward to May. Beneath 4 meters of snow in a ravine, they finally uncover the last 4 bodies. And folks, this is exactly where the case leaves the realm of a tragic freezing incident and goes completely, utterly off the rails. Applying a clinical medical examiner's lens to these bodies reveals sheer horror. Ludmila Dubina found with her tongue missing. And it wasn't surgically removed or cleanly extracted, it was just gone, along with her eyes and the soft tissue of her face. Nicholas Thibault-Brignol had a skull fracture so severe that experts compared it to the sheer force of a high-speed car accident. It was thousands of pounds of pressure applied all at once, not just a simple fall. And Alexander Zolotaryev had a similarly crushed chest. His ribs were shattered in a pattern that's consistent with a massive compressive force applied to his entire torso simultaneously. And yet, despite all of that, here is the absolute most impossible forensic detail of the entire case: 0. That's the exact number of external wounds, marks, or bruises found on the skin over those completely crushed bones. Whatever shattered their skeletons from the inside out left absolutely no marks on the outside of their bodies. 0. Faced with this impossible forensic puzzle, what did the Soviet government do? They immediately classified the investigation results. They closed the whole mountain to the public for 3 years, no real reason given. And the only official explanation handed down to those grieving families was this deeply chilling, incredibly vague phrase: the hikers had died as a result of an unknown compelling force. Case closed. Just like that.
But of course it wasn't. Let's look at Section 5, Declassified Evidence and Theories.
The case definitely didn't stay buried forever. Decades later, researchers finally managed to claw back fragments of the original file under partial declassification. And what they found inside, it only made things weirder. I want to present these facts to you completely neutrally, exactly as they sit in those declassified records. First, investigators found high levels of radiation on several of the hikers' clothes. Specifically, it was the kind of direct radiation that comes from a radioactive source, not just general background accumulation. Second, a camera found in the snow, which belonged to Zolotaryov, contained final photographs taken in the dark from inside the tent. They show these weird, blurry orange lights hovering above the mountain. Add to that, witnesses in 2 nearby towns independently reported seeing glowing spheres moving over the Urals that very same night. And years later, the Soviet military actually confirmed there had been testing in the region. They wouldn't say what kind, and they wouldn't confirm or deny if it happened on that exact night, but they were there. Now, another prominent working theory brought forward by later researchers involves a geographical phenomenon called a Kármán vortex. Because of the very specific shape of Dead Mountain, certain wind conditions can basically act like a giant instrument, generating infrasound frequencies. That's sound waves below the threshold of human hearing. At the right intensity, infrasound can actually induce severe panic attacks in humans. People who experience it describe uncontrollable terror with no visible source, like that primal, overwhelming feeling that something unseen is standing right behind you in an empty room. It triggers an automatic fear response in your body that completely bypasses rational thought. This theory attempts to explain how 9 deeply rational, highly trained survivalists could inexplicably cut themselves out of a tent and walk calmly to their deaths. But as we look at the evidence as a whole, for me it always comes back to the half-prepared evening meal left sitting on the floor of the tent. Whatever happened up there, it happened right in the middle of dinner. It forced a terrifying split-second choice. Side A, staying and facing whatever was inside that tent in those final chaotic seconds. Or Side B, fleeing and freezing to death in the minus 30-degree darkness. They chose Side B. They couldn't fight it, and they obviously couldn't hide from it. They chose a frozen death. The mountain is still there, the file is still only partially open. As you process the facts of this forensic cold case review, I want to leave you with this final thought. Somewhere in the middle of the unnatural radiation, the theories of weaponized infrasound, the glowing lights in the night sky, and human bones crushed from the inside without a single scratch on the skin, there is a definitive answer, and it's an answer that someone, at some point in history, decided was worth keeping secret, even if the price was 9 dead students. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I highly encourage you to keep digging into the evidence.